length, we turn to essentialism and instrumentalism debate, the oldest debate in the field, or at least the oldest debate after the Second World War. Essentialism is older than instrumentalism. But anyway, the debate took place in the late 60s and early 70s. Essentialism is an older idea, oldest theory, and is still the most popular theory in the press. So whether it's the New York Times or The Economist, two of the most influential English language newspapers and magazines in the world, or the Financial Times, or India's leading newspapers, when you talk of Hindus and Muslims, often, I think Indian newspapers are more sophisticated about this, often the argument is made that these are ancient hatreds or medieval hatreds that have continued. Right? There's nothing called Islam in ancient India, because it did arrive actually in the 8th century. Yes, 1711 is the conquest of Sindh, and around the 650s or so, a few years after the death of Muhammad, Muslim merchants arrived in Kerala, most probably preceding the conquest of Sindh in 711. So Islam arrived initially in the form of trade in the state of Kerala. So that was clearly ancient. Anyway, the point here is the claim here is that these are old animosities. This way of looking at ethnic conflict and violence emerged at a time when the early enthusiasm witnessed at the birth of newly decolonized nations had started ebbing. In country after country, the stories seem to be similar. Nation building encountered serious ethnic resistance. Pakistan, India, Africa, Indonesia. It was becoming very hard to create national level civil polities without serious resistance from some group or the other, including violent resistance. Why was this so? Why could smaller ethnic identities not be subsumed under a larger national identity? The first scholarly response was that the decolonized states were new, and these animosities were old and deeply historically rooted. The primordialism of ethnic groups or religious groups was a stronger bond, a more powerful motivator of human conduct than the new pull of civic ties being created by new states. New pull of civic ties weaker than the pull of strong, historically rooted bonds. There are various scholars who propose this. Clifford Geertz, the great anthropologist, is very well known, who made this argument. New states, old ties, I think. Old Societies, New States was the title of the book. Clifford Geertz. There was Edward Shills, who made this claim. This is 1963. In Edward Shills' case, 1957. But it came to be identified with, in recent times, last 30 years, with a scholar called Walker Connor, who made the famous claim that man is a national, not a rational animal. A famous line. Man is a national, not a rational animal. At the core of nationalism, he argued, lay the notion of shared blood and shared ancestry, and shared blood and shared ancestry drives human conduct, not rational considerations of civic responsibilities and civic reciprocities. This argument in some form, in certain other hands, is sometimes called modernity is doomed. What are the problems in this view? It's wrong. First of all, the idea of variations. The idea of variations. If ethnic antagonisms are so deep-rooted, why is it, as my book argued 10 years ago, why is it that Hindus and Muslims have repeated riots only in some cities but not in others? This is the idea of spatial variance. All right? If they're so deeply rooted, why is it that Hindus and Muslims of Lucknow don't have riots, but Hyderabad they do? Why is it that Hindus and Muslims of Aligarh have endemic rioting almost? Last 10 years no, but until then. Why? But not the city of Calicut. City of Calicut is 37% Muslim, as is the city of Aligarh. Right? And another example there was even more tightly controlled, Ahmedabad and Surat. You take a train from Ahmedabad, you get to Surat in what? 3 hours? In 3 hours you're in Surat. They were historically part of the same linguistic area, Gujarat, the same province. It was Bombay Presidency under the British, and then Bombay Province after 1947, and then Gujarat after 1960. The state of Gujarat. Ahmedabad is one of the worst. Surat, when I finished my work, and it's still true, Surat had only one riot in 100 years. That was after the mosque was torn down in Ayodhya. December and January. Several riots around that time, not one period of rioting. Otherwise, Hindus and Muslims managed to conduct their business without killing each other. Right? So clearly, there is something about local contexts, local institutions, whatever the reason, which, even if antagonisms exist, can abate them. The claim about variation is not that Hindus and Muslims in Calicut love each other and Hindus and Muslims of Aligarh hate each other. There are always some complaints, there are always prejudices. Prejudices and complaints don't have to take the form of violence and riots and killings. We can live with prejudices. Yes, a prejudice-free world would be good to have. Can a prejudice-free world exist? Gandhi believed it could. And we admire him for that, but most people would argue it's hard for human beings to have a world without prejudices. Can we have a world without violence? That may be more achievable. Very hard, but more achievable. So that's an argument about spatial variance, right? Which creates problem for any claim that says ethnic antagonisms are deeply rooted. They may be, but that doesn't necessarily explain violence. Right? Second is not spatial violence, spatial variation. Aligarh versus Calicut, Ahmedabad versus Surat. But temporal variance, variance over time, as opposed to variance over space. What is variance over time? Yugoslavia was quiet for nearly 40 years and exploded after that. If ethnic antagonisms between Serbs and Croats and between several other groups of Yugoslavia they were so deeply rooted, why did they have peace for 50 years? Presumably, some institutions, certain kind of politics manage those prejudices. So, essentialism argument is what we call an institutions-free and politics-free argument. Conflict cannot be institutions and politics-free. We need to bring politics and institutions in to understand. Right? Okay. Now, the second argument. Consider the second problem with this claim. Sons of the soil versus new migrants. Is it the case that all conflicts or all forms of ethnic violence in the world can be reduced to medieval or ancient animosities? How about sons of the soil violence is sponsored by Shiv Sena in Mumbai starting the late 60s against South Indians, and then in the 80s against Muslims. Even if you say Hindu-Muslim cleavages are deeply historically rooted and these animosities go back to 7/11, when Sindh was conquered, or let's say Delhi Sultanate in the 11th century, or let's say Aurangzeb, or Babur. What is the relationship between Maharashtrians of Mumbai and South Indian migrants in the 1960s? They had no relationship. There's nothing called ancient hatreds there. They never dealt with each other. Or the Maharashtrians who came down south during Vijayanagar times, right? Or later to Tanjore, let's say. Maybe those Maharashtrians actually never went back. In Mumbai, the arrival of South Indian migrants in the late 60s leads to the birth of Shiv Sena and attacks on... This is an entirely modern problem. It has nothing... And can you give more examples of this? Indonesia and Malaysia, the Chinese came when? The second half of the 19th century from China. Most did not go back. They are Malaysian Chinese and Indonesian Chinese. A lot of violence against them. Right? So, there are so many examples one can give where the term ancient hatred or historically deeply rooted antagonism is a conceptual non-starter. The claim of constructivists is, yes, that's an old identity, but the way it is experienced today is very different from the way it was experienced in older times. It is experienced in a modern way. Meaning what? In the pre-modern times, communities were essentially local. However the term local is defined. Village-based, a few villages, a particular region. Communities were not national and extra-national and extra-local. They were not. Because with today's technology, if we are Muslim, we can feel the hurt. This is what Islamic fundamentalists have claimed. We feel the hurt of Palestinian Muslims in Jerusalem or in Gaza, right? Or in West Bank, which was not possible earlier. We can see them on our screens. Right? So the way the identity is experienced today is dramatically, fundamentally different from the way it was experienced earlier. It was a local identity. So it's not that it's not that Islam is the same everywhere. No, there are various forms of Islam. Right? But being a Muslim in pre-modern times was a very local phenomenon.